Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the question of P versus J and whether the INFJ is arguably the least J of all the J types. I don't know what you think, guys, but personally, I incline towards that opinion. And I'm going to try to explain why I think that. Now, of course, what we need to do prior to explaining this, to exploring this, is to agree on a definition of P versus J, the distinction. Because if we stick to the official distinction, which is essentially that a P-type has a function stack where the first function that they extrovert is a perceiving function versus a J-type whose function stack is such that the first function that they extrovert is a judgment function. If we take that official definition of the distinction into account, but it makes no sense to say that the INFJ is the least J of all the types. It's neither more nor less J than ESTJ or ISTJ or INTJ or ENFJ or whatever. Just like for any other J type, an INFJ has a first extroverted function in their stack, FE, which is auxiliary, and it's a judgment function, therefore J. Okay? If you take an ENFP, for instance, their first extroverted function is their dominance. It's NE, a perceiving function, therefore P. Okay, and you can apply that to everything. So if until now you were still a bit unclear about the P versus J distinction, just stick to that. The first function that you extrovert in your function stack, is it a judgment function, or is it a perceiving function? Now, we both know that in the culture or in the wider forum of discussions about types and that kind of stuff, P versus J tend to have other connotations. And they have connotations that relate to, the whole being organized versus being kind of disorganized, being decisive versus being like more exploratory, being like full of plans and lists versus being kind of into improvisation and not having too much of a plan and going for the free form and all these different things. So structure versus free form. Structure being Janus and free form being P. I won't say the words because it sounds like something else. So basically, what I'm saying is, if we think about P perception versus J judgment in terms not of the functional difference that I explained earlier, but more in terms of what J's tend to come across as genuinely in real life versus what P's tend to come across as generally in real life, then the INFJ, I think, is the least likely to come across as a J. So we agree, this is not what we would call the official accurate definition. It's for most people, when they think about, they try to identify whether a person is a J or not, instinctively they won't try to think about, do they use TE as an auxiliary? The first thing that they will think about will be, they will try to look for like objective signs that the person's a J. Because it's true that if a person is super organized, makes all the plans, always has a schedule for everything, and doesn't like improvisation, that person is definitely more likely to be J than P. And the opposite holds true. If a person loves improvising, exploring for the sake of exploring, doesn't like too much structure, is not into the idea of like planning, that far into the future, but favors the present moment, that person is much more likely to be P. This is true. Now, there's no law for this. It just so happens that these observations tend to be correlated with the extroverting of either a perceiving function or a judgment function first. So why do I think that, given these preliminary observations, the INFJ is the least likely to come across as a J? And you could infer from this that they would be the most likely to come across as a P. Okay, potentially. So meaning that someone who thinks that they are P and therefore cannot contemplate the possibility of being a J or being INFJ might be wrong and may in fact be INFJ, even though they think that they have a lot of traits that are indicative of being a P. Well, I think there's a few reasons for that. You know, the functions that are the most associated with J-ness are TE and FE, of course. But if you think about it really hard, in our unconscious, when we try to identify a person's type or we try to think about our own type, the very first weird, like, basic reflexes that we have, they correspond more to testing whether we use TE than FE. Because this idea that a J is decisive, organized, logical-ish, depending on whether they're T or F, all these different things, well, they correspond to TE more than FE. Because the objective organization of your environment has to do with extroverted thinking. Extroverted feeling takes people into account. And it's true that if you're an extroverted feeler and you take people into account, that's not all that you do as an extroverted feeler, because you interact with people within a context that is relatively organized in terms of where people fit and how you interact with them and, these things. So you need to organize your pattern of interaction with people in a way. But it's less obvious for an FE user to come across as a J than for a TE user. So what this suggests is that an ENTJ, who's T dominant, an ESTJ, T dominant, an INTJ, T auxiliary, and an ISTJ, T auxiliary. These four types, if a person is of that type, they're probably more likely to identify quickly as a J. More likely, not saying for sure, I'm saying it's much more likely because they happen to use the TE function. Now we have four other J's that, according to my little framework there, might compete with the INFJ for least likely to be seen as a J. We have the ISFJ, we have the ENFJ, we have the INFJ, and we have the ESFJ. So these types, they do not use TE, therefore they use FE and TI. I would say that among these four types, it is still quite clear that the INFJ is the most likely to come across as a P. Why so? Maybe first we could dispose of the ENFJ and the ESFJ, by the way. Because the ENFJ and the ESFJ, they use FE, like the INFJ, but they use FE as their dominance. Therefore, their extroverting judgment, even though it is towards, it has as its object people prior to things, like TE would, it is still an extroverted judgment function. So it is still going to come across more than in the case of the INFJ, whose extroverted judgment comes as only an auxiliary to their introverted intuition. But the introverted intuition, the dominant function of the INFJ, it's a perceiving function. So in a way, and this is not in a way, actually objectively, the INFJ is a dominant perceiver. Just so happens that the dominant perceiving function of the INFJ is NI, which is convergent, but is still a dominant perceiving function, which explains why the INFJ can come across quite spacey sometimes. inside their own minds, INFJs are very, very exploratory. But they manifest more organization in their outer world via FE, but only as an auxiliary. So the ENFJ and also the ESFJ, who are dominant FE users, are probably going to come across more J-ish. The ESFJ, in fact, often more than the ENFJ, because they use SI. And a user of SI who is either a dominant or an auxiliary user of SI is often going to come across as a J, because SI is a function that tends to refer to a belonging within a broader architecture and to enjoy finding a place within that architecture and within a functioning architecture where things have a place and constitute a broader framework that has a pattern and that works according to that pattern. As a result, and SI as a result of that, trusts the pattern, and even when it's exploring new possibilities, refers back to the pattern that it knows to work. Right? So it's a grounded function. It grounds someone in a place. It's not a very exploratory function in and of itself. So it's not going to come across very P-ish, Therefore, the ESFJ, who uses FI as auxiliary to FE, is going to come across, in general, even more J-ish than the ENFJ, who still has NI but as an auxiliary. So we have disposed of these two, and we're left with ISFJ and INFJ. Well, what is the main difference between an INFJ and an ISFJ? That the ISFJ is an SI-DOM, introverted sensor, whereas the INFJ is an NI-DOM, an introverted intuitive. But as I just said, SI is much more J-ish in appearance by its relative attraction towards order and architecture, well-placed architecture of functioning architecture that works and that has been proved to work, where you have the different pegs that are there to perform that function. Is going to come across more J, because the INFJ does not have SI, in fact does not use SI very well. And therefore, there's only one J left, the INFJ, who is the least likely to come across as a J for the reasons I gave. Dominant intuitive, and dominant perceiver, right? So dominant perceiver. Now, not only are we dominant perceivers, but what makes us J is the less J-esque or J-ish of the two extroverted judgment functions, FE versus TE. It's the less J-ish, and we use it as an auxiliary, not even as a dominant, to a perceiving function. In these conditions, from this perspective of understanding J versus P, of course, the INFJ is going to sometimes come across as the P, because they're not always going to come across as the most practical, decisive, organized. In fact, INFJs are quite organized, but it might not come across at first. They plan very long term, but do they let others know about it? It requires a bit of time to see that. And it's the same with the INTJ, but at least with the INTJ, another person would see the TE and they wouldn't see it with an INFJ. And in fact, a lot of the time, for me personally, it's not always easy to distinguish between, say, an INFJ and an INFP, for instance, if it's very superficial of an interaction on the forum and in reality. The only way that I can identify it at first is that I can see that the INFJ uses FE. Because the FE use, if you're used to it, if you know what it's like, you know that you're not talking to an INFP. You see someone who's like not very extroverted, so rather introverted and sensitive and abstract, but they use FE, you know it's an INFJ. Because an INFP's FI is manifested so differently that you can identify it that way. But it's, in many ways, the INFJ is a kind of P, but a weird kind of P. It's a J, but sometimes in the shape of a P. A living paradox, like the INFJ is in its own life, pretty much all the time. Okay, see you guys. Let me know what you think.